Welcome to Webinars for Busy Lawyers. We are so glad that you joined us today. My name is Laura. I'm a law practice advisor with LCL. If this is your first time joining us, welcome. LCL does free confidential services for legal professionals across Massachusetts. One of my favorite programs we do is a monthly webinar for busy lawyers where we bring in lawyers with expertise to share some tips and in a short time frame. We know you're all busy. Give you some takeaways with around half-hour presentations. Today, we are so lucky to have Miriam Kosowsky with us. Miriam has a wealth of experience. She is an attorney mediator with over 25 years of experience. And of that, 10 years was exclusive mediation experience. On the other side, too, she also has 7 years of corporate litigation experience, so she can speak to why mediation can be a better strategy than corporate mediation. She is a graduate of Harvard Law with honors. And in the interest of time, I encourage you to read more of her bio, which will be on the site. To address some questions, you will get the slides afterwards, and you will get the recording afterwards. And if you would address your questions in the Q&A, we will do those following Miriam's presentation. Okay, let's see. And I see that I'm getting some feedback. Are you getting feedback with your audio? There's an echo. Okay, I'm not hearing an echo, but it looks like we have some of our participants. Miriam, are you hearing an echo?
Yes.
You are. Okay. So you know what? I will turn it over to Miriam, and I will switch devices on my end and see if that can resolve it from there. So Miriam, why don't you take it away?
Okay, hi, thank you everybody for joining in. And just, do you hear an echo now? Hopefully not. I'm going to talk to you about the benefits of mediation strategies to better serve your client. Sorry, was that? And basically, I've been mediating exclusively for over a decade. And what I find is that my clients, even years later, will call me and tell me how happy they are that they chose this approach, that their relationships are better, and that they've had long-lasting benefits. And you really can use mediation tools for anything that you do, whether it's personal or in your business. So I look forward to talking to you more about that. Okay, and the next slide. Sorry, the slide is not advancing. Laura, the slide's not advancing. Could you?
Yeah, that's okay. So thank you all. I will say too, this just shows that as lawyers, you know, we have to go with things, and especially with tech, there's always some up and down and some things that you address on the spot. So since it's not advancing on your end, I will pull it up on my end, Miriam. And in the meantime, how about you start talking, and then I will pull up the screens from what you're telling me and go from there. Oh, also, would someone just address in if I mute on my end to let us know if you still hear the echo or not, and then go from there. Thank you.
Okay, so the overview today of what I'm going to talk about are the benefits of mediation, then some mediation tools, and then I'll take some questions. Next slide, please.
Hold on just a moment, Miriam. I just have to switch programs.
Oh, here, I've got it. So here you see two children. They've been really excited all day. There were cupcakes that they were looking forward to have. They come home, there's only one cupcake. So what do? Now, as lawyers, we are paid to have solutions and to tell our clients what to do. We also usually consider ourselves as fairly intelligent. It seems to us that there might be a pretty easy solution to this problem, but let's just hold this for a second and let me go on, and while you're thinking about that, because it might not necessarily be the best solution, the one that you're coming up with. So next slide, please. One question is, for whom does mediation work, and how long do the benefits last? There's always been a question, and we mediators had it also, does mediation really work, or is there a selection bias? In other words, are people who choose mediation predisposed to a collaborative approach, meaning that they're more amicable, more willing to compromise. And in that case, maybe they would have settled even without mediation. So what we found, though, is that there was a 12-year longitudinal study done by Robert Emery, a PhD. He's preeminent in the field, and he has performed many, many research studies. In this study, he followed 71 high conflict families who had chosen to litigate. So he studied them for 12 years. The study basically had judges rating the top 10% of contentious couples. Then they used random assignment, a flip of a coin, to decide who would be in the mediation group and who would be in the continued just the way they were continuing in litigation. The sample was young and low income. What was important is the mediation was short term, 5 hours on average. It was problem focused, but sensitive to emotions, especially to grief. The initial benefits of mediation were clear. 90% of the couples who mediated were able to settle their disputes amicably. Now remember, these are people who were considered the most litigious. So it's not just that they were predisposed to be cooperative. And then contrary, only 25% of those in the litigation group were able to settle their dispute. In other words, 75% of those who stayed in the adversary system had to undergo the stress, cost, and continued hostility of going to trial before a judge who ultimately decided their fate. What was also really interesting to see was the lasting benefits of mediation. The non-custodial parents in the mediation track were 3 times more likely to see their children at least once a week. This is crucial because in other studies, it was shown that when college children who were children of divorce were asked to say yes or no to the answer to the question of, I sometimes feel like my parent doesn't even love me. People who saw their non-custodial parent fewer than once a week felt like they usually answered yes, that they really thought that they weren't loved. So the fact that these people were able to see their children more, or at least once a week, is really important. They were also 4 times more likely to speak with their adolescent children by phone weekly. They had less conflict with their former spouses, despite seeing them more often. And each of the parents rated each other's parenting abilities much more favorably than in the other group. So we see that even with people who had started out being litigious and only had around 5 hours of mediation, the benefits were long lasting and were extremely important. Mediation is beneficial to everyone. Long-term business relationships, for example, if somebody has been having a long-term relationship with a customer or another business, just think if they had one problem and they went into litigation, that would absolutely just ruin their relationship and they wouldn't be able to continue. Or family businesses. This is often tragic, where the second or third generation often fall out and they just don't agree as much as the founders did. What often results is that different branches have feuds with each other. They're not invited to family events, and it's really, really sad. If you have mediation in family businesses, then the family, can stay intact. They could still have personal relations with each other, but they just separate the businesses. But you might say, okay, what about one-time interactions? And I'll tell you, as a corporate litigator, nobody was ever happy to be in litigation. Defendants didn't want to be sued. Plaintiffs didn't want to spend their time having to sue. It was costly. It was time away from business, and it was stressful. And as you know, anytime there's a conflict, there's a lot of stress. So if there are ways that you could work to lessen that and to work together, it really, really is extremely helpful. So what are the mediation tools to help you with mediation? And one thing I do want to say is that sometimes people say, oh, they've been to corporate mediation, but often corporate mediation isn't using these tools. Sometimes what corporate mediators do is they just go back and forth, giving different, the people are in separate rooms, they don't really talk to each other, and it's just money going back and forth. Somebody's saying, well, they'll take 100, okay, well, they'll take 80, well, let's maybe split it in the middle and have 90. I'll tell you from a personal experience, when my daughter was 10, she was walking alone and a dog came and bit her and ripped her clothing with a dog bite. She was bleeding. and the owner of the dog ran away, leaving a 10-year-old by herself after having been bitten. Not only that, but we didn't know if the dog had rabies or not. And my daughter, had the owner not been found, would have had to undergo very painful rabies shots. So we wanted to mediate because we wanted to let this person know, because when we spoke to her on the phone, she just did not seem to care at all. And also she lives on a place on Commonwealth Path where lots of people and lots of kids walk. And I was thinking, had it been a baby, it could have really been a terrible situation. So we went to mediation and we really just wanted an apology. Instead, we were put in a separate room. A mediator went back and forth with money. So my daughter ended up getting some money for the pain that she had undergone, but we really did not feel like we had a resolution. That's not why we had gone to mediation. So when I'm talking about mediation, it's using tools such as exploring interests, active listening, reflecting back, reframing, reality testing, finding gems, and generating creative solutions. And I will talk about each one. So when you're active listening, somebody might have an asserted demand about something, but what you really want to do is discover the underlying deep-seated interests. Why is the person saying this? Why does the person want what they want? So here, let's go back to the picture of the children arguing about a cupcake. And on the right, it's basically showing you that sometimes people's reasons or reasons why they want something might have layers to them, might not be as obvious as it might seem. So I think most of us would think, okay, just split the cupcake in half. But if you ask them why they want the cupcake, they might give you an answer different from what you had expected. So for example, the girl might really want the whipped cream and the cherry. And the boy might say, oh, I don't like that stuff. It's too gooey. I just want the cake. So instead of splitting it in half, a better solution, which you get from being curious and asking why they want the cupcake, is that the girl will get all of the whipped cream and the entire cherry, and the boy will get the cupcake. And that way it'll be a win-win solution because they'll get 100% of what they want. And this happens a lot. You know, there's also a story you could say with an orange. Maybe somebody wants the peel for the orange rind for a cake, and maybe the other person wants part of the orange just to eat the orange. So it's really helpful not to jump to conclusions, and we as lawyers, you know, that's what we're paid for often, but to actually sit back and to ask the questions. Asking open-ended questions, being curious, is what will help you really determine what are the true interests. You ask why, how, what if, how come, when, and listen. And I know we are so used to listening while meanwhile in our mind, we're thinking about the next response. But instead of just listening in order to respond, really try to hear. And if people have a problem and it seems intractable, sometimes what you could do is ask the person, what are you willing to give the other person in order to get what you want? Or you could say, what are you willing to, what do you need to get in return in order for you to be okay not getting what you want? I had a case like this with a couple. They had children, but they also had 2 dogs. And both of them wanted the dogs to stay with them, or at least the husband wanted one of the dogs to stay with him. And he gave a really compelling argument. He said, you know, he was not going to stay in the marital home. He was going to spend less time with the kids. He said, it's going to be very lonely. And therefore I want at least one of the dogs. Well, the mother said, you can't split up the dogs, just like you wouldn't split up the kids. And, you know, with many families, the dogs go with whoever is with the children, but in this case, that wasn't going to work. And it seemed like it was an intractable problem because both of them wanted it. They had compelling reasons for wanting to be with the dogs. So I said to each of them, well, is there anything that you would accept in return instead of, you know, being with the dogs? And I just joked. I said, like a flat screen TV. And surprisingly, the husband, who had just given this really, really heart-wrenching argument about being alone, when he heard about the fact that he could get a huge flat screen TV, and a big lounger, he was like, okay, that's fine. I'll do that instead. And he was happy, and the wife was happy. So it's really always helpful to really ask and to really figure out what are the reasons they want something, and what they can get in return. The next question, the next tool that you use is reflecting back. People want to be heard. And reflecting back is often repeating the statement. It doesn't have to be word for word, but basically showing, yes, I've heard you. I understand what you're saying. So if somebody says, you know, I'm not getting enough money, if they're talking to their boss and they're saying, I'm just not getting enough money, and I can't live like this. You could say, so you're really worried about making ends meet. And the person will say yes. And when you hear what you're saying reflected back to you, you really do feel heard, and people often nod and they smile. And I have a funny story about this, that when I was taking a Siblings Without Rivalry course, this was the first time that any of us had heard about reflecting back. And we thought it was kind of silly, what, you're just going to repeat back what somebody said. So we were kind of smirking. And the teacher looked at us and she said, you think that this reflecting back is quite silly, don't you? And we all smiled and we nodded and we said, yes. And she said, I just did it to you. And you see how good it felt to have somebody really reflecting back what you were thinking. Another important tool in mediation is reframing. So if you look at this picture, what you can see is, you could see, I'm using the cursor, a skeleton. But if you look a different way, what you could see is a woman looking in the mirror. And often people have statements that almost are like a skeleton. They sound nasty, and they could be attacking. And when somebody's attacked, they're not going to be able to listen to you because they're too busy trying to defend themselves and put up a wall. So if somebody says something in a way that sounds attacking, what a mediator does is reframes it, tries to put it in a more neutral way, or sometimes even in a positive light. So if somebody says, I am sick and tired of my boss micromanaging me all the time, what you could say instead is, so I see you want to have some independence. You want to be able to work on your own and find solutions. And this way, a boss might think, wait a second, this actually isn't such a bad thing at all. I find this often when parents are arguing about parenting and they're getting very upset about at each other because they each want a certain amount of time with their children. And I will sometimes step back, pause, and say, wow, this is really beautiful. Both of you want to spend time with your children because you love them so much. And nobody in this world loves your children more than the two of you. And there are so many people who just wish that the other parent would take an interest in their child. And suddenly what had seemed like this terrible thing, that both were arguing about spending more time with each other, with their kids, ends up being seen in a much more favorable light. Also important is reality testing, entertaining the request and exploring the ramifications before saying no or yes. So in our case with parenting, for example, if somebody would come in asking for, we'll say 50-50 custody, and normally the attorneys could be duking it out. But what we could do is instead say, okay, let's see how that's going to work. And sometimes somebody will realize, you know, I'll say, so what does this entail? What's going to be needed if you want 50-50? Sometimes it means picking up a child on those days at 3 o'clock, being able to be home if a child is sick, or if there's a snow day, or if the school calls and for some reason they're having an early dismissal day, which schools seem to have more and more nowadays. So what will happen is the person will say, well, I can't do that. I need to travel, or I can't do that because I'm not allowed to leave at 3 o'clock. And without saying no, the person himself or herself will realize that that's not viable. Alternatively, it might be that the person has solutions that the other party hasn't even thought of. Like, well, you know what? I will just black out time from 3 to 5 every single day, so I'll be able to do it. Or I will arrange with this person to be able to take the children. So really reality testing, checking out, seeing how something will go. Sometimes what we'll do also is we'll spend a month or two just looking to see, okay, let's try this type of parenting and see whether it works or whether it doesn't. And that's often very helpful without, so that people really could see without saying yes or no. Another mediation tool is finding gems, highlighting positive comments or interests. So for example, if somebody will say, you know, we've been working together for 30 years and now this guy screwed me, you could say, wow, it sounds like for 30 years, you've had a really good business relationship with each other. And there are lots of times where people will just say something and put in a positive comment about somebody. And that's where you stop and you really highlight it to show that there are positive facts. Part of GEMS also is emphasizing areas of agreement, such as with talking with the parents, that both of them love the child or both of them have the common interest. People might agree, okay, we need renovation. So you say, great. So you've agreed on the fact that you need renovations. Now let's just talk about the details. But it's really helpful always showing the points of agreement. And what sometimes I do also for people who are old enough to know what records are, is that I'll tell them that even if the relationship has ended now, it's sort of like a record that even though there's a huge scratch at the end, and there might be some scratches along the way, it doesn't mean that there hasn't been some beautiful music along the way. And sometimes they'll even talk about a vacation they went to that was very nice, or something that they did with their kids, anything that shows some commonality. And that happens, you could do that with people in business or in any field. It really is very helpful. And using all of these tools, such as active listening, reflecting back, reframing, reality testing, and finding gems, you could create and generate creative solutions. And as John Fisk, who is a luminary in mediation, says, we are just visitors in our clients' lives. We do not know so much about them. We just know a little bit. They are so much better at knowing what is going to work for them. So it's really, really important to be curious, to ask those questions, and to listen to them. For example, I had a case where both the husband and the wife wanted the marital home. Now, this sounds like it sounds like a zero-sum game, right? One person will have the house, one person won't. And especially something like a marital home is extremely emotional. How in the world are they going to be able to figure out what to do? Well, I delved in, I was curious. I asked the why questions. Why did each one want the home? It turns out that they had different reasons. The husband wanted home ownership. And as he told his wife, you know, I always wanted to buy that. I always told you I didn't want to rent because it was throwing money away, in my opinion. And that's why he wanted the house. Well, she wanted the house because she had had a trauma growing up of repeatedly having to quickly leave her house with her mom. And it was very traumatic to have to quickly go and find another place. So what they decided was that she was going to have a year to stay in the house so that she could leisurely go and find at her own pace a suitable home for herself. Meanwhile, he would be in a rental for a short term. And then once she found a place for her to be, then he would end up having the house and they would do the buyout then. This satisfied both of their interests. She was able to not have the trauma of having to find a place quickly, and he had the ultimate goal of being able to have home ownership. It worked very well for them. This is a solution that would not have happened in litigation. Probably the house would have been sold. And it definitely would not have been something that two lawyers would have come up with. I have another case, where there was a contractor and he was upset because the customer hadn't paid. And the customer said, you know, the contractor didn't do a good job. So in a private session where I was speaking individually, the contractor said to me, you know what, the customer is just trying to get money from me. He's just trying to get a discount and he's trying to rip me off. And that's something that's very important to know, that even in a business dispute that seems like it's totally business, no emotions, emotions always come into it also. And this person felt like he was being cheated. And that's why he was very angry. And I asked him, I looked at him and I said, did the customer make you take off your socks when you came in? Take off, excuse me, your shoes when you came into the house? He said, yes. In fact, I was wearing socks. And when he showed me something in the bathroom, it was a little wet and my socks got wet. And I said, you know what? Often people who, not always, but a lot of times, people who really care about details also want you to take off your socks. Your shoes, sorry. It's just one of those things. And I said, my husband is like that. And I will tell you that if something were 1/16 of an inch off, it would bother my husband every single day. And the guy said, really? I said, really? Now that the person knew that he wasn't being taken advantage of, but this was really a concern to the customer, they were able to go and discuss rationally what they should do. And the solution they came up with, I thought, was brilliant. The contractor agreed that he'd come back to the house and he would change the renovation for free, just moving the 1/16 of an inch. In return, the customer would allow him to keep his sign advertising his company up a little bit longer than the work would take. This was important to the contractor because the customer lived on Route 9 and this would be incredible advertising. Both of them got what they want and they had a great solution. And in fact, they were so happy with what they had decided that they had originally come in really angry at each other, barely talking to each other. And after the mediation, they went out for beers. Two other factors that are very helpful in mediation are empathy. It's really, really important, not only for the mediator to be empathetic and to really make it feel like a safe space where people could talk and there's no judgment. You really, really are trying to understand each person and think of them as good people and really listen to what they have to say. But it's also helpful to try to foster empathy with the parties. So sometimes a tool that could be used is, as I had mentioned about reflecting back, you have one party reflect back what the other party has said and vice versa. That way they sort of stay in the other person's shoes and it helps them a little bit more to see the other side and to have a little bit more empathy. And lastly, receptivity. Often, we'll say in the divorce context, one person has been thinking about divorce for a long time. The other person, when is asked for divorce, often is looking like that. Can't believe that it's happened. Yes, they might have had some issues, but they never thought that it would come to this. Or sometimes something else has happened in another context, and also somebody is reeling from it. At that point, they're not really receptive to be able to really think. You have to give them a little bit of time. And also, it's really helpful to work on the small issues first, because that way you get a sense of trust, a sense of trust in the process, so that when it comes to the bigger parts, you've already worked a little bit on it and there's trust and you've also calmed down a little bit. Another tack that is helpful is if somebody is really feeling very emotional and it's very hard for them to think, you ask them to write a list or to do something that's going to then kick in the other part of their brain that is more focused on rational thought than on emotions. Finally, it's really helpful to create a conducive environment. First of all, mediation is confidential, which means that people are allowed to explore many possibilities without feeling like they're going to be confined to one. So it's confidentially is key. Voluntariness. I'm sorry about that. And that is to say, you could stop at any point if you want a break, or if you want to stop at all and come back another time. Really gives them a lot of sense that this is something that they have control of, a supportive environment. So again, just being really open, really understanding, really listening, not judging, and being just somebody who they could talk to and get support. Seating also is helpful. If you see people across from each other, they'll have a dynamic that they're against each other. So when my clients come in, no matter what the field, I will have them sitting next to each other. And that way they're feeling like they're working together on the solution. And lastly, food. And peanut butter M&Ms are very helpful because they have protein in them. Studies have shown that when people are hungry, they are less likely to compromise. Judges who are getting close to lunchtime are less likely to grant parole requests. So it's very helpful, and that's why most mediators have food. So those are just some of the tools that are used for mediation. And I'll tell you, I just had a couple in their 70s who came to me. I had seen them years before, and they had a provision in their agreement that alimony would end at when the wife turned 70. And they called me up and they said, you know what? The guy said, I've been earning a lot and my ex-wife has been really helpful with the kids and the grandkids. So we think that, I think that I could give her more, that I don't want alimony to end at 70. So we came and we spoke about it, and there had been a provision that she would get a certain percent of his bonus. And I asked, okay, what percent of bonus are you thinking? And he said 25%. And she looked at him and she said, you're being so kind to me to extend alimony. You keep the bonus. And it just really touched my heart, because these are people who had been working together. They had gone through mediation, and they were just being so incredibly nice to each other and so supportive of each other. And I felt like this is why I do mediation, because it really brings out the best in people and usually brings out the best solutions. And now I'm really happy to take any questions you have.
Miriam, this was wonderful. Oh my goodness. Your many years of mediation experience have really shown that you've developed so many great strategies for this. I also want to thank you before we dive into questions, and I encourage more people to put questions in the Q&A box as well. I want to thank people for your understanding. I hadn't realized that I'd had an echo coming from my device. Thank you all for bearing with me as I switched over devices. I want to thank Miriam especially. You just continued beautifully with presenting, which I know it's tough to do when you're having other distractions. And I wanted to thank you, both you and the audience, because that extra challenge, you really then were able to practice some of the skills that Miriam was talking about, even though that was not my intent with it, but to be more active listening, more empathy, be more supportive and receptive. So I want to thank all of you so much for bearing with us on that. So I also want to note that because I switched devices, if people had put in Q&A on the first device, not all of those would have come through for me on this one. We do have one Q&A, so if you did, please put your Q&A questions back in the chat. In the meantime, we do have a question that came through Miriam. So this person notes that they really liked your earlier reframing example, in which you observed out loud that the squabbling parents are an example of two parents who really loved and valued their children. Having succeeded in lightening the mood in the room and reframing the discussion, how did you then transition back to arriving at a mutually agreeable child custody solution?
Well, thank you. That's a very good question. So basically, after changing reframing, then the people were more receptive to listen to the request for more time. And in fact, it just totally lowered the pressure. So they were able to agree, because instead of seeing it as somebody's trying to take time away from me, they were seeing it more as let's make sure that we each spend time with our child. So it sort of naturally just flowed. I said, okay, and they were able to just work out a solution because they had lowered the tension level.
That is brilliant. Thank you so much. I want to hit too on some of your examples, because I think that these were so helpful in really illustrating the purposes of how you noted that people could work together and look for win-win solutions rather than zero sum. You talked about the child schedule. You talked about the 2 dogs, the cupcake and how that was great too, that one wanted the frosting and the cherry and one wanted the cake. You also had the beautiful record analogy about how even if there were some scratches at the end, there still could be beautiful music. You mentioned 7 key mediation tools with exploring interests, active listening, reflecting back, reframing, reality testing, finding gems, generating creative solutions, and then taking us through examples of them. Do you happen to find that people struggle with one or two areas more than the other on the mediation tools? For example, is maybe reality testing or one of the others harder for people to come naturally to and something they might need to practice more?
That's interesting. I think for lawyers, it's interesting because I think for lawyers, the hardest part is the active listening, because we are so used to generating solutions that it's very hard for us to sort of sit back and not say an answer and really wait for our clients. And as you've seen in the two last examples I had given you, the solutions that the clients worked at were solutions that would not have definitely come to people automatically. These were really exceptional and very creative solutions. So, and I think that for therapists, the people who were trained as therapists, what their hardest point is just having a little bit too much of the therapy mode and less of the reality testing and other aspects. So it really, I think, depends. Also, our challenges depend on what field we come from and what we're used to doing, because sometimes it does involve a little bit of a switching gears.
That makes a lot of sense. And it's something I would not have thought of, about how if you come from a litigator background or from a therapist background, that really would frame how you approach the situation. And then you may need to focus more on the active listening or on the creative solutions. That's excellent. Do you have suggestions if people may, for example, let's say that they're in a divorce, that people started coming to them thinking it would be non-contested. As people have gone on, then one of the parties has wanted to make it more contentious and contested. Do you have ideas on how they could help their clients potentially use mediation strategies to get back on track, to have more amicable negotiations and an easier solution for all?
That's interesting. Well, there's always the way you look at is you look at the alternatives to mediation. Often what I'll have a client who will have gone to an attorney, and the attorney will have promised the moon. And, there are amazing mediation friendly attorneys, but sometimes there are attorneys who are out for the juggernaut, and they'll come and they'll say, well, my attorney just told me that I will get X, Y, and Z, So my answer to them was always, okay, have that attorney put it in writing and guarantee it. And what we also have is, the best alternative to mediation, the BATMA. And that is, if somebody wants to get into the very adversarial way, you could say, okay, well, let's see how that's going to play out. And often with mediation and divorce, that is one of the few contracts where a judge actually has to sign off on it. So if somebody's getting very, very contested, sometimes what we could do is say, you're saying that you're going to get 70-30, but in my entire time doing this, a judge has never given that. So that is part of the reality testing. I think reality testing is helpful. And then just, trying to find the common, what I'll often tell clients, and I think that's something for all of us to remember, is we do not have to go home with the decisions that are made. So in other words, for an attorney to get the best solution for their client, they don't have to deal with all of the other ramifications. That maybe then that means the kids are going to be upset, or maybe that means that they're not going to have a good relationship with their spouse for years. Now that might not translate into money, but that is significant. And that's also very important for attorneys to say to their clients. Like one thing that I think, if people are getting contentious, is to say, think about it 10 years from now. How are you going to want your kids to be able to talk about how you conducted yourselves during this time? Are you going to want to say that there was no holds bar. They took a lot of the money that could have been used for us for college, you know, and they spent it arguing. Are you going to say that they treated each other miserably? Or are you going to want them to say, hey, you know what? They actually, you know, I'm sad that they got divorced, or sometimes I'm happy that they got divorced, but they really conducted themselves well. And another really important thing, which we have to tell clients, is that, you know, you two are the supports for your children. You are the two supports. They need you. They count on you. And although it's really hard, you really need to be there for them. And that studies and studies have shown that the way that kids do okay after divorce is if their parents have been amicable with each other. And it's not only helpful to the kids, it's helpful to them too. And one helpful thing about mediation is just the fact that there's so much more communication. I have this great story where there's a couple, really a wonderful couple, who was with me, and just as they were leaving, as an aside, the wife asked the husband, "Oh, you know, our daughter's having a music recital in an hour. You know, where are you going to sit?" And he looked at her and he said, "Well, I guess you want me to sit as far away from as possible." And she looked at him and she said, "No." He said, "Really?" And she said, "No." He said, "I'd love to sit with you. Would that be okay?" She said, "Yeah, I'd love for you to sit with me." And in the end, not only did they sit together, but he came and he picked up the daughter and the wife, and they all went together. And that is something where, had they not had the communication, he would have sat far away thinking that's what the wife wanted. The wife would have been upset. And most important, the girl, when she finished playing, wouldn't have known where to look. Do I look to my right? Do I look to my left? You know, I don't want to insult anybody. This way, if they sat together, it was showing the daughter that, yes, even though we might be parenting apart, we're still a family and we still love you. And these transformative occasions happen all the time in mediation. I can't hear you.
Sorry, I was still on mute. That is wonderful. That is really inspiring, because when you've talked about these different couples today and how they have been able to resolve their differences, whether it's the two parents being able to sit together so that way the child looking out for the music recital could know where to look for the parents, or the one that decided to extend alimony and then the other one, said no for the bonus, or when you're talking about the house and that one allowed them to have the rental for the year, and then the other one would get the long-term home ownership. These, as you say, they sound like they are transformative, and that they continue not only for the life of the continued communication of the two adults involved, but also the whole family, particularly if there are children involved, that it sounds like you're going to have that other parent in your life for your child's whole life, even if you want minimal contact, so that amicable really has benefits for all.
And just one thing which I think is also important, and that is that what we tell the kid, the parents, is each child is made up of 50% of you. So even if you have an adolescent child who's talking badly about the other parent, it's 50% of them. So if you trash talk the other parent, you're trash talking 50% of your child. So, I mean, as somebody who's married for 35 years, it's hard to always, actually live, talk that talk, walk the walk. But it really is. It's very important to realize that. So, and it just makes it so much better for everybody, for the kids and for the parents involved.
That is wonderful. And that's a great mindset to keep in mind. It's almost like reframing the whole situation to really have that positive spin. We have another question came in. This person notes, "Miriam, thanks so much for sharing, quote, the rest of the story. I truly found all of your examples and illustrations, for example, the cupcake, the silly reflecting, oh yes, when you were noting about how your group was finding something silly, and then when they reflected back to you and heard you, it not only validated you, but it had you really feel more involved with the talk. Continue on, helpful, and plan to use them myself going forward." Oh, Ray, that's great.
Thank you. I'm so happy it was helpful.
That is wonderful. If people have more questions or comments, we still have some time, so invite you to also put them in the Q&A. Miriam, I do have a question too. When you noted at the end about creating conducive environments, you went through examples such as the seating to sit them next to each other so that they think about working together rather than feel they're working apart. You noted about food. Are there other things for creating a conducive environment? For example, would it be helpful if for mediation, if you have one room where people would meet together, but also private spaces where each side could go off with their counsel to talk before coming back, and maybe have food, I don't know, as a towards the end of the day or a time when you plan to end, to really hope to encourage and speed along that resolution? Are there other ideas like that on how people can create those conducive environments for people to really talk and reflect?
Some people have very comfortable chairs. I unfortunately where I am, I don't as much, but yeah, exactly what you said was great. Also round tables, if possible, instead of like squares, and often also not everybody has counsel. That often people come without. We always recommend counsel. Often what people will do is they will hire counsel sort of as a coach. So it's first of all less expensive, because if your attorney knows you're in mediation, then it's not as expensive as if the person thinks that they might have to go to trial, because trial is the most expensive part about litigation. So the retainer is going to be much higher. So if you tell somebody, I just need you sort of to check to make sure everything is fair, etc., then it's less costly. And that's often what I'll have. I'll have clients coming in on their own to the mediation, but then referring back to attorneys. And yes, definitely private sessions are often helpful. There's always a debate with mediators whether it's good to have private sessions or not. I always get the okay from clients, but I found that when I had continuing education and I played the part of a party, I always wanted to talk privately to the mediator. So I'm like, okay, I want to give my clients this option too. And I always tell my clients, listen, I would not be doing my job if I take one person's side. So please know that anytime, even if I speak to your spouse privately, it's always in aid of the mediation. And what I always try to do is if one party has called me and spoken to me, I'll call the other and just give them equal time, just so that they don't feel like there is any partiality going on. And also if one person reaches out to talk to me about scheduling, I'll always say, please tell your spouse that I'm more than willing to talk to them too, so that everybody feels like they're being treated fairly.
That makes great sense. And then it really keeps that lines of open communication and also the neutrality.
Yes.
I want to go back to you have such deep experience in this. You had noted that you had both 10 years of exclusive mediation, and then you had 7 years of corporate litigation experience. Could you contrast some about not only from your side, but from the clients, and how you thought it impacted the client's journey? And were they able to really get solutions that worked for them in the end?
I found that with in litigation, even with plaintiffs, even when they won, there was often going to be an appeal. So that was going to be even longer. There was going to be, they had to get the money. So, right, you win a judgment, it doesn't necessarily mean you're going to get the money or whatever it is. And in litigation, it typically is money. You're not getting anything else. Whereas in mediation, you get the creative solutions. So I found that litigation was, one reason I left it was litigation was just not nobody was happy. The plaintiffs weren't happy, the defendants weren't happy, the lawyers weren't happy. And it just was not, it was sort of soul sucking, I found. Some people like it. I enjoyed trials, but I just found like I was sitting there, especially as I had kids. I have 4 kids, and I would be sitting there telling them to come up with solutions and to share. And meanwhile, I was going into my job. Well, then I only had 2, and saying we want it all. And it just I don't know, it just did not work for me and my personality. And people were really annoyed. They did not want the litigation. They wanted to go on with their business. And this was a distraction. And this was an annoying and stressful distraction. So I find that it is really night and day between litigation and mediation.
That is great. Thank you. You noted about to be curious and to think back to some of those questions we learned in grade school, you know, the who, what, where,
Right.
when, why, that can sometimes help with generating creative solutions, and to have open-ended, you know, sessions where you can really be curious. Do you have ideas on how lawyers could start this early on, whether it's doing an initial intake with a client, or whether it's talking with the client about case strategy? Is it something that you would approach earlier in the case life cycle or later on?
That's a great question. I think I would approach it really early on and say, like, what do you really want? You know, here you're telling me you want this lawsuit, but if you could have anything, you know, what ideally would you want? And that's really helpful, because it might be something very different from what they could get in court. And then what you would try to do is then you try to work towards that solution. And I think what's also helpful is if the two parties who are litigating could have some way where they could talk, not necessarily to each other, but in a way that they won't feel like they're going to be at a disadvantage if they have to litigate, but where they can feel each other out. Because sometimes I know that we'll say with doctors and patients, often with malpractice, what the patient's family or the patient is looking for is an apology.
Mm.
And if the doctor just apologizes, or just to know that this will not happen again to another patient, that's what they're really looking forward to. And that's what they want. So if there's a way for them to be able to talk to the doctor without it being an admission of guilt on the doctor's point, that will then come against the doctor in litigation, I think that could resolve a lot of disputes. Similarly, you know, in teacher cases, if a teacher is fired or laid off after many years, and they might say that it's ageism or whatever it is, sometimes what the teacher's looking for is just the recognition that you've been an incredible teacher and we owe so much to you. And, you know, maybe we just can't because we're a struggling school and we can't afford a budget or something, but something where you really get to satisfy the deeper interest that the person has, and not just, well, we'll give you some money. And because then people often just aren't happy anyway. They're still upset about what happened.
Mm. That is very helpful. So how do you walk that line? Let's say that you're an attorney representing that doctor in that hypothetical you just mentioned. How might you encourage the client to apologize, to give that recognition, that validation to the family, if that's what they most want and it came there for, without it being an admission of guilt? How do you help them navigate that?
So that, I mean, I think you'd have to have some confidentiality provisions in place, and that anything that is said cannot be used in trial as evidence of guilt. But it is a very fine line, and that's why a lot of times people are scared to do it, and often attorneys will say don't talk, you know, to the other side. But there have to be ways. So I'm not as versed in that, so I can't give the best on the fly answer, but there definitely are protections that could be put into place. And I think that there'd be many fewer suits, because usually if you sue a doctor, there's almost always going to be a settlement. So you might as well get what you're really looking for too.
That makes sense. Oh, and that might make sense too, why there's so many non-disclosure agreements that come out with certain types.
Exactly.
So what would you do if you have a client and they came in and you are trying to get down to what they want, and you say, you've gone through a bunch of your strategies, you've been active listening, you've been reflective back, but what if your client is stuck on just wanting revenge, or they're stubbornly angry at the other party and they say things like, all I want is for my ex to get nothing? How do you help them get past it and help go to the underlying interests other than to get past the anger and the betrayal that they may be feeling initially?
Great question. I think one part is time. So there are stages, and it's almost like the stages of grief, but in divorce, sometimes they cycle all at the same time, but definitely people tend to get less angry over time. So if they're not ready yet, you might give it a little bit more time, or you let the person really vent. And that's one thing. If somebody continues saying something, it means they haven't been heard. But if they're going on and you could just say, wow, it sounds like you're really, really angry, and this must really have been painful for you. And just having that recognized and validated, that often is really helpful to ease the anger and the hurt. And maybe to have the other person say, we'll say it was an affair, to say, I'm really sorry that I hurt you. And that sometimes will help with the pain too. But you do raise a good point that there are sometimes mediation isn't a cure-all for everybody. There might be somebody who's there who is just unrealistic and is like, my way or the highway. I'm not giving anything. And in that case, mediation is not going to work. And in that case, they do need to go to an attorney and just, realize that they're not going to get all that they want. But for some people, mediation is not going to work. Or if there's somebody who's extremely abusive, who is just not going to work. But often in situations, it's interesting, there's always been a question whether victims of domestic violence could go through mediation. The old assumption used to be no, but it actually, if it's done well, it actually gives them a voice, and it really helps them. And so long as there are protections in place, that if it's done really well, then it really can help a lot. And so you really have to see, because you just don't want to be in a situation where it's not going to go anywhere. And what often we say is, if you're working that hard, then maybe you should fire the clients because they're not suited for mediation. So part of mediation is also understanding the very rare cases where it's just not going to work. And then you just don't want to take your client's money.
This has been so helpful. I see we're running up on the hour again. Miriam, I want to thank you. This was so insightful. You gave us a lot of great strategies and takeaways, really food for thought. This has been tremendous. I want to thank you. I want to thank our audience. You have had some great feedback. Thank you again for bearing with us. I will note that our webinar for busy lawyers next month, we don't have a date scheduled yet, but it will be on how you can have strategies for attention. And Miriam, I want to turn it back to you for closing thoughts. Anything else that you would really like people to take away from this topic today? Or if they have further questions, would they be able to potentially reach out to you?
Absolutely. Absolutely. More than happy to talk to anybody about this. If you have any questions, and definitely also if you've had mediation successes, I'd love to hear about them. So definitely, write to me and I'd be very happy to speak with you too. And give me a call. That's the best thing. My email is on my website. My cell phone is on my website, and that's the best way to reach me.
That is excellent. Thank you all so much. We really appreciate your time. Miriam, we appreciate your expertise, and I hope you all have a great rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for listening. Bye. Thank you, Lau.